In 1208 BCE, there was an Egyptian pharaoh named Merneptah, and he commissioned this massive, this really towering stone monument just to brag about a recent military campaign.
Right, typical ancient king behavior. They love their monument.
Exactly. He had his artisans carve this huge list of all the peoples and all the places he had supposedly wiped off the map in the region of Canaan. He wanted the world to know about his absolute supremacy.
Yeah, he wanted everyone to be terrified of him, basically.
But history has a really profound sense of irony, because Merneptah actually failed to wipe out one specific group that was listed on that stone.
He really did. And what's fascinating is that specific group of people had actually just recently signed a localized geopolitical peace treaty with the creator of the universe.
Yeah, and that specific treaty essentially made every human king, including the mighty pharaoh Merneptah, functionally nothing more than middle management.
Which is just wild to think about. I mean, it completely upended the ancient world's power structures. You have these human empires desperately trying to carve their authority into stone.
Right, literally carving it into rocks.
Yeah, well, right next door, there's this radically different experiment in human governance taking root, one that completely redefines who actually holds the right to rule.
And that experiment is exactly what we are unpacking for you today. We are taking a deep dive into a comprehensive historical and theological survey of Old Testament theocracy.
And this is based on research by Chris R. Velasi, which is just an incredibly detailed survey.
It really is. And the mission for this deep dive is to completely reframe a concept that you probably think you already understand. Because when you hear the word theocracy, what pops into your head?
Oh, but usually nothing good.
Right. If you are like most of us, you immediately picture a modern oppressive political state. You picture religious police, mandatory doctrines enforced by violence, and a system where personal freedom is just completely crushed.
Which makes total sense because the modern colloquial use of the word theocracy
Yeah.
is almost universally tied to authoritarianism.
Exactly. We imagine a human government using the language of the divine as a weapon.
Yeah, using it to justify unchecked absolute power over everyday citizens. It feels incredibly dystopian.
But Velasi's survey of the Hebrew Bible presents a reality that is virtually the exact opposite of that dystopian image. We were going to explore the ancient concept of YHWH's covenant kingship over Israel.
Right, and right out of the gate, to set the stage for you, we really have to establish what this text actually is and maybe more importantly, what it isn't.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. So what's the primary thing to keep in mind here?
The primary distinction to keep in mind throughout this entire discussion is that the biblical theocracy is not a blueprint for modern statecraft.
Okay.
You cannot lift this ancient structure out of the Iron Age and seamlessly map it onto a 21st century nation state. What we are examining is a redemptive historical structure.
A redemptive historical structure. Okay, let's unpack this concept because we need to deconstruct this massive idea into digestible, fascinating pieces for you.
Absolutely. So to understand this ancient framework, the survey actually takes us all the way back to the canonical beginning, Genesis chapters 1 through 11.
And the immediate surprise here is that the idea of God's kingship doesn't start with the nation of Israel. It actually starts with the dirt of creation.
Exactly.
Boom.
God's kingship precedes Israel by a really long shot. The foundational premise of the entire Hebrew Bible is that the nations of the earth, the cosmos itself, are already under his absolute sovereignty.
Right, just by right of creation alone.
Yeah. When you read the creation narrative in Genesis 1, humanity is made in the image of God. But to the ancient mind, that phrase carried a very specific political weight that we honestly often miss today.
Right, because we usually hear image of God and we think of something spiritual or philosophical, like humans having a soul or rationality or the capacity to love.
Yes, but in the ancient Near East, an image was a profoundly political concept. It was literally how an empire functioned.
Wait, really? How
Yeah.
so?
Well, in the ancient world, a high king or an emperor obviously couldn't physically be present in every single village or conquered territory across his vast domain.
Right, they didn't have Zoom.
Exactly.
Ah.
So he would set up physical statues, literal images of himself in those far-off territories.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And when you look at that statue, you were supposed to recognize the authority of the king who placed it there. The statue was a physical placeholder for the sovereign's rule.
So when Genesis says humanity is created in the image of God, it's actually making an incredibly subversive geopolitical claim.
It really is. It's saying humans aren't just biological organisms. They are the living, breathing statues of the Creator placed in the territory of Earth to represent his rule.
That is the core of it. Humanity was given delegated dominion. And I think the technical term the source uses for this is acting as a vice-current.
Right. Vice-currents. They were appointed as deputies. Their stewardship over creation was never meant to be an independent sovereignty. The authority they held was entirely derivative of the true king.
And if you look at the subsequent chapters in Genesis, like the fall in the garden, the flood, the Tower of Babel, it reads less like a random collection of myths.
Oh, totally.
It reads more like a continuous political history of a failed proxy government. It's a chronicle of what happens when the deputies decide they want to be the sovereign themselves.
The Tower of Babel narrative is actually the perfect example of this. It is a story of humans attempting to centralize power and exercise autonomous rule without submission to the ultimate king.
They try to build a tower up to the heavens to make a name for themselves.
Yeah, and the text strongly suggests that human rule without divine submission inherently becomes anti-theocratic. It leads directly to oppression, rebellion, and ultimate fracture.
Right, which leads to the dispersion of the nations at Babel. That's basically the collapse of that autonomous human project.
Exactly, which creates a massive problem for the cosmos. The delegated deputies have gone rogue, the world is completely fractured, and the ultimate king needs a mechanism to restore that relationship.
And that mechanism brings us to the patriarchal promises. Genesis 12:15 and 17. God singles out one man, Abraham, and makes a series of sweeping promises.
Sweeping promises that involve a royal seed, a specific land, and a universal blessing. And all of this is structured legally as a covenant.
Right. The Hebrew word for covenant is berit. And this is where the historical context becomes utterly fascinating, because the biblical berit didn't just drop out of the sky as some novel religious concept.
No, it heavily borrowed from the established legal and political vernacular of the ancient Near East. Specifically, it mirrors what historians call suzerain-vassal treaties.
Okay, so if I'm an average listener, I might have vaguely heard of a vassal, maybe in the context of medieval knights or Game of Thrones.
Right, yeah, feudalism.
But what exactly does a suzerain-vassal treaty look like in the late Bronze Age? Like, let's say I'm a small-time king of a tiny city-state in Canaan, and a massive Hittite emperor rolls up to my borders with a terrifying army. How does this treaty work?
Okay, so the Hittite emperor in this scenario is the suzerain, the high king. You, the small city-state ruler, are the vassal.
Got it.
So to formalize your submission and, avoid being completely destroyed, you enter into a highly formalized written treaty. These documents followed a very strict, recognizable pattern.
What's the first part of the pattern?
First is the preamble, where the suzerain introduces himself, like, I am the great king. Second is the historical prologue, where the suzerain outlines all the past favors he has supposedly done for you.
So it's to establish why I owe him loyalty. So it's basically the emperor saying, remember last year when I didn't burn your city down and I protected you from those raiders? You owe me big time.
That is exactly the tone. And following that historical prologue comes the core of the treaty, which is the stipulations. This is the massive list of laws and demands.
So this dictates my tax burdens, my military obligations, and explicitly forbids me from making alliances with any other high kings.
Yes, exactly. Finally, the treaty concludes with a lunk of divine witnesses, usually the gods of the respective nations, and a chilling list of blessings for obedience and curses for rebellion.
So if I obey, my crops will grow. If I rebel, my city gets salted and my dynasty ends.
Precisely. So when we read the Hebrew Bible, we are seeing the Israelites take this standard, universally recognized political format and inject it with the most massive, subversive twist imaginable.
The twist that changes the entire trajectory of human history. Because in Israel's covenant, the suzerain is not an Egyptian pharaoh. It is not a Hittite emperor or an Assyrian warlord.
Right. The suzerain is the living God. YHWH himself steps into the role of the high king.
Which brings us back to that idea of middle management that we talked about earlier. If you are signing a localized treaty, but the other signatory isn't a neighboring warlord but the creator of the universe, that fundamentally changes the nature of human authority.
Oh, absolutely. Every single human institution in Israel, every judge, every priest, every elder at the city gates is instantly stripped of absolute authority.
Because they answer directly to a higher invisible sovereign who holds the actual contract.
Yes. It creates a system of profound accountability, and this dynamic is fully formalized at a very specific geographic location, which is Mount Sinai.
Right, Exodus chapters 19 through 24. When you read that, you are essentially reading the ratification ceremony of this cosmic suzerain vassal treaty.
It is the constitution of the ancient theocracy being drafted in real time.
Yeah.
But the sequencing of events at Sinai is absolutely critical to understand here.
Yeah, the survey emphasizes this heavily because it completely shatters the stereotype of a heavy-handed, oppressive religious regime that demands blind obedience before it offers anything in return.
The order of operations at Sinai is arguably the most important theological point in the entire Hebrew Bible. Israel is redeemed first, and only then are they governed. Deliverance happens before legislation.
Okay, walk us through that mechanism, because usually in an authoritarian state, the law is the mechanism you use to avoid being destroyed. You follow the rules, and the dictator lets you live.
Right. But look at the historical prologue of the Sinai Treaty, which is found at the very beginning of the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. God doesn't start with demands.
He starts by saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery.
Exactly. The grace of the Exodus precedes the demands of the law. He pulls them out of centuries of brutal systemic oppression under a human dictator.
Right.
He brings them through the sea, he sustains them in the wilderness, and he brings them to the mountain. Only after they are safely liberated does he actually give them the stipulations.
So the law is not a tool they have to use to earn their salvation or to somehow buy their freedom.
No, not at all. The law is the constitution for how a newly liberated people are supposed to live so they don't accidentally recreate the Egyptian slavery they just escaped.
Wow. In Exodus 19, God literally calls them a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. They are being constitutionally ordered by divine law to be a radical alternative to the surrounding empires.
It's a stunning paradigm shift. It
Yeah.
really is.
But, whenever we discuss ancient grand theological frameworks like a liberated group of slaves signing a cosmic treaty with the Creator, a natural skeptical question arises for anyone listening today.
Sure, like, did this actually happen?
Exactly. How do we know this society actually existed outside the pages of a religious text? Was this concept of a covenant nation just a philosophical ideal developed by brilliant writers centuries later? Or did this highly specific theocratic society leave actual footprints in the dirt?
Well, if this radical constitution was actually implemented, it couldn't have just existed in the abstract. A nation structured like this taking up physical space in the Levant would leave physical scars on the landscape.
Right, they'd have to.
They would leave records buildings, and inevitably they would collide with the political ambitions of their neighbors. And when archaeologists dig into the dirt of the ancient Near East, that is exactly the geopolitical footprint we find.
Yeah, the survey devotes a significant amount of space to the archaeological record. It lists 4 major artifacts that ground this discussion in historical reality. Let's start with the one I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive, the Merneptah spell from 1208 BCE.
Yeah, so the stele is an upright stone slab, usually carved with text and imagery, erected as a monument. The Merneptah stele was discovered in the ancient Egyptian city of Thebes and now sits in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo.
And it stands over 10 feet tall. And as you mentioned, it is Pharaoh Merneptah boasting about his military conquests in Canaan.
Yes, and the mechanism of how hieroglyphics work is what makes this stone so crucial. It's not just the phonetic spelling of a name, it's the determinative symbol attached to it.
Break that down for us. What is a determinative symbol?
So, Egyptian hieroglyphics use determinatives, which are silent symbols at the end of a word that tell the reader what category the word belongs to. For most of the conquered enemies on the stele, the scribes use the determinative for a city or a foreign land. But when they carve the name Israel, they use the determinative for a foreign people.
A foreign people, so a socio-ethnic group, perhaps nomadic or not yet fully settled in a centralized city-state, but distinctly recognizable as a unique group.
Exactly. The translation literally reads, Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. It's the earliest known extra-biblical reference to Israel, proving they were a distinct, recognizable people group on the map in the late Bronze Age.
But moving forward in time, we don't just see them as a nomadic people. We actually start seeing evidence of a centralized dynasty. Fast forward to the 9th century BCE, and we hit the Tel Dan stele.
Right, so this artifact was discovered in northern Israel at an excavation site called Tel Dan, but it wasn't written by an Israelite.
Who wrote it then?
It's an Aramean victory fragment, likely commissioned by King Hazael of Aram Damascus. He's bragging in stone about his military victories, specifically claiming to have killed 2 kings.
And in the Aramaic text, he explicitly refers to his enemy's dynasty as the House of David.
The House of David, yes. So Almost entirely outside of the biblical text, we have an enemy nation officially referring to the southern kingdom of Judah by the name of its dynastic founder.
That is a monumental piece of evidence, because for a long time, some historians theorized that King David was purely a mythical figure, right? Like a sort of Israelite King Arthur.
Yeah, that was a common theory. But the Teldan style securely anchors David as a historical reality, because you don't name a geopolitical dynasty after a myth. You just don't.
Right, and right around that same time, just after 842 BCE, we find another enemy bragging about fighting Israel, the Mesha Stala, which is currently housed in the Louvre.
The Mesha style, or the Moabite stone, is a long inscription. It's 34 lines of text in a Moabite dialect that is incredibly similar to ancient Hebrew.
And it was commissioned by King Mesha of Moab. The biblical text actually mentions Mesha in the book of 2 Kings, right?
It does. On this stone, Mesha recounts how the Israelite king Omri had oppressed Moab for many years, and how Mesha eventually threw off the Israelite yoke and reclaimed his territory.
Wow.
Yeah, it is a gritty, detailed account of intense interstate conflict.
Yeah.
It totally confirms the reality of Israelite military power and territorial expansion in the Transjordan region.
So we have these massive stone monuments dealing with wars, kings, and dynasties. But the fourth piece of evidence the survey highlights is actually much more mundane, which almost makes it more fascinating to me. We jump to the 8th century BCE, and we find the Samaria ostraka.
Ah, yes, the ostraka.
Now, the word ostraka sounds incredibly formal, but from what I understand, ostraka are essentially just ancient trash, right? Why are we using broken pottery to reconstruct a divine kingdom?
Because ancient trash tells you how a society actually functioned on a random Tuesday. Ostraka are indeed just broken pieces of pottery.
Okay.
In the ancient world, papyrus was expensive and really hard to come by, but broken pots were everywhere. So bureaucrats and merchants used these pottery sherds like scrap paper writing on them with ink.
And the Samaria ostraka were excavated from the ruins of Samaria, which served as the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel.
So what exactly was written on these sherds?
They're purely administrative documents. They are literal tax receipts and shipping invoices.
No way.
Yeah. When a farmer out in the provinces paid his royal taxes in the form of jars of olive oil or aged wine, the scribes in the capital would write a receipt on an ostrakon.
Oh, that's amazing.
It would record the regnal year of the king, the type of commodity, the district it came from, and the name of the sender.
It's literally the ancient Iron Age equivalent of an Excel spreadsheet.
That is exactly what it is. And the reason this is so crucial to our understanding of the theocracy is that it shows us the complex mechanics of their royal administration. We can visualize an ancient bureaucrat sitting in a storehouse, tallying up seasonal harvests.
Managing clan provisions and tracking the kingdom's wealth. But I do have to ask a probing question here, because there's a danger of conflating different types of evidence.
Oh, for sure. We have tax receipts on pottery, and we have victory monuments from rival nations. Does finding the name Israel on a rock or finding an invoice for a jar of olive oil actually validate the deeply theological biblical narrative of a divine theocracy?
That's a great question.
Or does it just prove that these people existed farmed land and had standard ancient world political beefs like everybody else?
It's absolutely vital to maintain that distinction. The physical artifacts do not prove the theological claims. Finding an ostrakon in Samaria does not prove that YHWH spoke from a flaming mountain at Sinai.
Right, we can't dig up a miracle.
Exactly. But what this archaeological evidence does is securely anchor the broad historical theater. It paints a vivid, undeniable picture that the theocracy was not merely abstract theology debated by priests in a vacuum.
It was a grounded reality.
Yes, it involved supply chains, real estate complex literacy, and the brutal realities of border wars. The physical evidence forces us to take the historical framework of the text seriously.
But that historical reality, with the sprawling royal administration, the taxes, the kings commanding armies against Moab and Aram, it brings up a massive, glaring paradox.
It really does.
Because according to the original constitution we just talked about at Sinai, Israel wasn't even supposed to have a human king like the other nations. Their whole identity was supposed to be wrapped up in having the invisible, living God as their suzerain.
Right, that was the whole point.
So how in the world did they get from a divine cosmic treaty to a human monarch taxing olive oil and building armies?
They arrived there through a catastrophic centuries-long crisis of leadership. To understand how the blueprint was fundamentally altered, the survey walks us through the timeline, starting with the period of the Judges.
Which lasted roughly from the conquest of Canaan through the 11th century BCE. And the book of Judges is notoriously chaotic. It reads like a violent, ancient pulp novel.
It is the absolute definition of covenant anarchy. During this period, Israel operates as a loose tribal confederation. There is no centralized capital, no standing army, and no king.
So what happens when they get attacked?
When a crisis arises, usually in the form of foreign oppression, God raises up a charismatic, localized leader, a judge,
Yeah.
to deliver them. But the mechanism is failing.
Failing because the people keep defaulting on the Sinai Treaty.
Yes, it is a vicious downward spiral of idolatry, foreign oppression, desperate cries for help, temporary deliverance, and then an even deeper plunge into moral decay.
The source highlights a recurring chilling phrase from the end of the book of Judges that really diagnoses the root problem. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Yeah, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. What does that phrase actually look like on the ground for an average Israelite family during the Judges period?
I can't imagine it was good.
It looks like terror. It looked like tribal civil wars, rampant violence, highway robbery, and constant vulnerability to heavily armed neighbors like the Philistines.
Wow.
The lack of centralized leadership combined with the total abandonment of the covenant laws of Sinai meant that the basic social fabric was completely disintegrating. The people were terrified, and they were desperate for stability.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the pivotal crisis in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 8. The elders of Israel travel to Ramah to confront Samuel.
Right. And Samuel is this incredible hinge figure in biblical history. He is simultaneously operating as the last of the judges, a prophet, and a priestly mediator.
So the elders come to him and they make a demand that changes their entire trajectory. They say, "Appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations."
Like all the nations. That forward phrase is the profound theological tragedy of 1 Samuel 8. You have to view this through the lens of the suzerain treaty we discussed earlier.
Right.
Their request is not simply a pragmatic administrative desire for better border security or a more efficient judicial system. When Samuel is heartbroken by their demand, God tells him they have not rejected you,
Yeah.
but they have rejected me from being king over them.
They are essentially looking at the invisible divine suzerain and saying, this arrangement isn't working for us anymore. It requires too much faith, and it requires too much moral obedience.
Yeah, they want a king they can see. They want a warlord to march out in front of them and fight their battles, just like the Philistines and the Egyptians have.
It is a fundamental rejection of their unique identity as a kingdom of priests. They want to trade their divine calling for conventional human geopolitics.
And the mechanism of God's response here is what I find so compelling. He doesn't just smite them for treason. He tells Samuel to issue a severe warning.
Right. God explicitly outlines the brutal economics of what an ancient monarchy actually costs. He warns them a human king will take your sons and conscript them to run before his chariots.
He will take your daughters to be his perfumers and bakers. He will seize the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive orchards to give to his courtiers.
He will tax your flocks, and in that day you will cry out because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you.
It is a devastatingly accurate description of how ancient centralized power operates. It extracts wealth and labor from the margins to enrich the center.
It is exactly what those Samaria ostraca would eventually record. And yet, despite hearing the exact price tag of this human institution, the people refuse to listen. They demand the king anyway, and God permits it.
He permits it, but he drastically regulates it. And this is where the Old Testament theocracy retains its unique DNA, even under a human monarchy.
Because the blueprint changes, but the core principles remain.
Exactly. The survey points us back to the book of Deuteronomy, specifically chapter 17, which lays out the constitutional laws concerning the king.
Right. Even though the monarchy is a concession to their lack of faith, the human king is not permitted to be a sovereign autocrat. He is severely legally restricted by the Torah.
Yes. Deuteronomy 17 places 3 massive limitations on the king's power, and each one is designed to prevent him from becoming a typical ancient Near Eastern tyrant.
Let's walk through those restrictions because they are incredibly specific. First, the king is not supposed to multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to acquire them.
In the ancient world, a horse wasn't just a mode of transportation, it was advanced military technology.
Yeah.
Chariots were the super weapons of the era.
Right, like ancient tanks.
Exactly. By forbidding the king from amassing a massive cavalry, the law is forcing the king to rely on YHWH for military protection rather than relying on overwhelming, terrifying human force.
Furthermore, Egypt was the center of the ancient horse trade. Going back to Egypt to buy horses meant structurally entangling the newly freed nation with the very empire that had enslaved them.
Yes, it's a profound restriction. The second restriction is he is not supposed to acquire many wives.
Now, aside from the obvious domestic complications, what is the political mechanism behind this restriction?
Well, royal marriages in the ancient world were rarely about romance. They were about foreign policy. You married the daughter of a neighboring king to secure a peace treaty and a trade alliance.
Oh, I see.
By restricting the king's wives, the law is restricting his ability to build a massive web of foreign pagan alliances. It prevents the king from compromising the nation's exclusive loyalty to the divine suzerain just to secure a political advantage.
That makes total sense. And the third restriction, he is not supposed to acquire excessive silver and gold.
Which prevents him from using vast economic power to buy mercenary armies or to insulate himself from the consequences of his actions. Wealth, military might, and foreign alliances, the three standard pillars of ancient statecraft, are all restricted.
But the most important part of Deuteronomy 17 is what the king is actually required to do.
Yes, he is commanded to write out a copy of the Torah for himself and to read it all the days of his life.
He is fundamentally positioned under the law, not above it. He is a covenant servant. His mind and his policies are supposed to be constantly shaped by the Constitution of Sinai.
Right. If he obeys, his reign will endure. If he disobeys, he is just as liable to divine judgment as the lowest peasant in the land.
And we watch this incredible tension play out in real time with the first three kings of the United Monarchy. First, we have Saul.
Yeah, poor Saul.
The survey describes Saul as possessing all the external physical traits the people wanted. He's tall, he's handsome, he has military promise, but he fundamentally fails the test of Deuteronomy 17.
Saul is a tragic figure because he treats the kingship as an autonomous right rather than a delegating stewardship. His fatal flaw is that he is driven entirely by the fear of man rather than the fear of YHWH.
When the pressure mounts, he bypasses the prophetic instructions of Samuel, he takes matters into his own hands, and his kingship becomes completely detached from obedience.
Which leads to his tragic downfall and, of course, the rise of David. Now, David is presented as the model covenant king.
But we have to be careful here because David is profoundly, deeply flawed. The text does not hide his massive moral failures. His adultery with Bathsheba, his orchestration of Uriah's murder, his disastrous census.
Right, it's all in there.
How can a man who commits those atrocities be the model king of a divine theocracy?
It is a critical question. David is not the model because he is sinless. He is the model because of his posture when confronted with his sin.
Okay, unpack that.
When the prophet Nathan marches into the royal court and points a finger at David, delivering a devastating covenant lawsuit for the murder of Uriah, David does not execute Nathan.
Right, which a normal king would absolutely do.
He does not double down on his royal immunity. He immediately submits to the prophetic rebuke. He says, "I have sinned against the Lord."
David's core identity remains that of a vassal.
Yes, his genuine repentance and his deep desire for worship are why God establishes a permanent covenant with his dynasty in 2 Samuel 7, promising that a son of David will always sit on the throne.
But then we get to that son, Solomon. And Solomon's reign is where the blueprint starts to critically fracture.
Yeah.
On paper, Solomon looks incredibly successful. He is renowned for his brilliant wisdom. He finally builds the permanent temple in Jerusalem, centralizing the worship of YHWH. He expands the administration and the borders. It looks like the Golden Age.
It really does look like a golden age. But the survey points out that underneath that glittering golden facade, Solomon is systematically planting the seeds of national destruction.
Wow.
Solomon is the ultimate cautionary tale that administrative brilliance without covenant fidelity will destroy a nation from the inside out. Remember those three restrictions from Deuteronomy 17?
No horses, no multiple wives, no excessive wealth.
Solomon aggressively violates every single one of them on a massive scale. He imports thousands of horses and chariots from Egypt. He amasses a harem of 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Just to cement his sprawling foreign alliances.
Exactly. And worst of all, to appease these foreign wives, he engages in blatant religious syncretism. He builds shrines and altars to foreign gods on the hills surrounding Jerusalem.
Then to fund all this, the massive temple, the royal palaces, the chariot cities, the sprawling court, he needs revenue. And he gets it by implementing exactly what God warned the people about back in 1 Samuel 8.
Oppressive taxation and forced labor. Solomon divides the country into 12 administrative districts, ignoring the old tribal boundaries to ruthlessly extract provisions for his court.
He actually conscripts his own people into labor gangs to work on his massive building projects.
He does. He turns the Israelites back into the very slaves they were in Egypt. But this time, the Pharaoh is an Israelite king sitting in Jerusalem.
It's an incredible, dark irony. And that heavy extracting royal bureaucracy is exactly what ultimately shatters the kingdom.
Yeah.
When Solomon dies in 931 BCE, his son Rehoboam takes the throne, and the people essentially beg him for tax relief. They ask him to lighten the heavy yoke his father put on them.
And Rehoboam arrogantly refuses, promising to be even harsher. And as a direct result, the 10 northern tribes secede. The united monarchy is permanently split.
And this brings up a crucial layer of the theocracy that we need to address, because when we spend all our time talking about kings, geopolitics, taxation, and royal bureaucracies, we are talking about a very high-stakes top-down institution. But how did this theocratic system actually impact the people on the ground? What was the social fabric like for the farmer paying those taxes, or the family living miles away from the capital?
To understand the daily reality of this theocracy, we really have to grasp their sociological context. The forest paints a detailed picture of an agrarian kinship-based society.
Okay, what does that mean practically?
This was not a modern industrialized nation where you could just move to a new city and get a job in a factory. Your entire identity, your economic survival, and your social standing were inseparable from your land and your lineage.
Right.
The basic social unit was the father's house or the extended household.
And they were living in an agrarian subsistence economy, meaning they lived off the land completely dependent on the seasonal rains for the grain, the wine, and the oil.
Yeah, a drought or a swarm of locusts wasn't just an economic downturn, it was a lethal threat to the entire village.
Exactly. And layered over that physical vulnerability was a culture driven by intense honor-shame dynamics. In a small, tight-knit village, your loyalty to the covenant, your treatment of your neighbors, and your business ethics were publicly visible and heavily scrutinized.
The survey introduces two vital Hebrew concepts here that really function as the social engine of this society. The words are mishpat, which generally translates to justice or judgment, and tzedakah, which means righteousness.
How do these concepts actually play out in the dirt of an ancient village? Like, what does mishpat look like on a Tuesday?
Well, these two words are the absolute beating heart of the biblical social ethic. Mishpat is about establishing a judicial order that reflects divine fairness. And in the ancient world, the local courthouse was the city gate. That's where the elders sat.
Okay.
Mishpat meant making sure that when a land dispute or a criminal case was brought to the gates, it was handled impartially. It meant not taking a bribe from a wealthy landowner to crush a poor farmer.
That's it.
Tzedakah righteousness was the broader ethical order required of everyone. Treating your workers fairly, leaving the gleanings of your harvest for the poor, not using false weights in the marketplace.
And the main theological point the survey makes here is that biblical kingship was never designed to be merely administrative.
No, definitely not.
The human king wasn't judged by God on whether he balanced the royal budget or secured the northern border. He was judged on whether he embodied another crucial Hebrew word, ro'eh.
Roe, meaning shepherd. This is the primary royal care metaphor in the ancient Near East. The king was the ultimate shepherd of the people.
So his primary job description was to ensure that mishpat and tzedakah were actively flowing down through every level of society, reaching the most vulnerable, like the widow, the orphan, and the resident alien.
Exactly. Now, listening to all of this in ancient agrarian society, based on the father's house, male elders sitting at the city gates, a male king sitting on a throne, it sounds like a heavily patriarchal top-down system.
Right. If I'm listening to this today, my immediate question is, where do everyday people, and specifically women, fit into this grand theological governance?
That's a very valid question.
Are they just passive participants, subject to the whims of male leaders?
It is a vital question, and it's one the survey addresses head-on. While it is undeniably true that ancient Israel operated within traditional patriarchal gender roles, the biblical canon does something remarkably subversive.
Oh, I love this part.
It repeatedly and intentionally elevates women as primary active agents in the covenant. The text actually bypasses the established male hierarchy to highlight female agency.
Walk us through some of the specific examples the survey provides, because it's a powerful list. Let's start with Sarah.
Yes, Sarah the matriarch. The entire Abrahamic promise of a royal lineage hinges directly on her faith and her body. Then you have Miriam.
Right, Moses' sister.
Exactly. After the Exodus, while Moses is the administrative leader, it is Miriam the prophetess who actually leads the redeemed nation in their first theological act of public worship.
And then, during that chaotic period of the Judges, you have one of the most striking figures in the entire text, Deborah.
Deborah is extraordinary. The male leadership at the time is paralyzed by fear of a Canaanite warlord. So what happens? Deborah assumes the roles of both judge and military strategist.
She literally holds court under a palm tree in the hill country, deciding the cases of the Israelites.
She summons Barak, the male army commander, and gives him his marching orders. She is the functioning center of the theocracy in that moment.
She is the one upholding mishpat when the men fail. And the survey also highlights Hannah. Her story in 1 Samuel seems so intimate, a woman weeping at the sanctuary because she is barren and marginalized by a rival wife.
But her prayer and her subsequent song of praise when she miraculously conceives Samuel actually provides the entire theological framework for the monarchy that follows.
Yes, Hannah's song declares that YHWH is the one who breaks the bows of the mighty, who raises the poor from the dust, and who will give strength to his anointed king. A marginalized woman's theological poem becomes the Magna Carta for the Davidic dynasty.
The list continues. You have Ruth, a completely marginalized, impoverished Moabite widow. Through her fierce covenant loyalty, her hees to her Israelite mother-in-law, she becomes the direct, vital, ancestral link to King David himself.
Wow.
You have Abigail, who uses incredible diplomatic savvy and wisdom to intercept David when he is blinded by rage, stopping the future king from committing an unauthorized bloodbath.
And much later, you have Esther, who navigates the lethal politics of the Persian Empire to save the entire Jewish diaspora from a state-sponsored genocide.
The theological takeaway the survey draws from this roster of women is profound. It demonstrates that the biblical theocracy is absolutely not identical with male rule.
Right. It is God's rule over the whole covenant community.
Yes, and very often the divine suzerain actively subverts human power structures by bypassing the official failing male leadership and using marginalized figures, specifically women in a patriarchal world, to enact divine justice and preserve the nation.
But despite these incredible, faithful individuals stepping into the gap, the broader trajectory of the human monarchy is disastrous.
Oh yeah, it's a downward spiral.
Despite the constitutional safeguards of Deuteronomy, the kings systematically fail to uphold Mishpat and Sagaka. The shepherds become the wolves. So what happens when the human middle managers completely ruin the franchise?
What happens is a catastrophic, agonizing collapse. The source tracks this decline chronologically, and it is a brutal history to read.
We already discussed the initial fracture, the division of the kingdom in 931 BCE into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This was the theocratic ideal splintering in real time.
And from there, it's a centuries-long descent, rapidly. The northern kingdom immediately descends into persistent state-sponsored idolatry. They actually build golden calves to prevent their people from traveling south to Jerusalem.
They utterly breach the covenant.
They do. And the consequences, as laid out in the original Sinai Treaty, are enacted. In 722 BCE, the terrifying Assyrian Empire sweeps in, lays siege to the northern capital, Samaria, destroys it, and deports the population.
The fall of Samaria. The survey is very explicit here. This wasn't just bad military luck. This wasn't just a small nation getting caught in the gears of a larger empire.
Right.
This was the covenant curse becoming a horrifying national reality.
Exactly. God used Assyria as the rod of his anger to enforce the sanctions of the broken treaty. The southern kingdom of Judah watches this happen and manages to linger for another century and a half.
Occasionally experiencing revivals under kings like Hezekiah and Josiah.
True, but eventually they follow the exact same path of idolatry and social injustice. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar breaches the massive walls of Jerusalem.
The events of 586 BCE represent the ultimate trauma of the Hebrew Bible. The Babylonians slaughter the leadership. They completely destroy Solomon's temple, which was the geographic epicenter of God's presence.
They depose the Davidic king, blind him, and drag him away in bronze shackles. And the population is forcibly marched into exile in Babylon.
The temple is burned. The king is captive. The promised land is lost. To an ancient observer, it would seem that the entire redemptive historical structure had completely and utterly failed.
The Sinai blueprint had been physically burned to the ground by Babylonian soldiers. YHWH had apparently been defeated by the gods of Babylon.
But this is exactly where a new group of extraordinary figures steps onto the stage to explain what is actually happening. The prophets, figures like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel.
Yes, and if you are listening to this today, You need to completely erase the modern caricature of a prophet from your mind.
That is essential. A biblical prophet is not a bearded wizard gazing into a crystal ball to predict the distant future. The survey emphasizes that the primary role of the prophet is to act as a prosecuting attorney.
I love that framing. It's so accurate.
So instead of a fortune teller, you should be picturing a lead prosecutor walking into a courtroom carrying a breached contract.
That is exactly the mechanism. The technical term for what the prophets are doing is bringing a rib, a covenant lawsuit against the failed shepherd kings, the corrupt priests, and the nation.
They literally stand in the temple courtyards, they read the stipulations of that original suzerain vassal treaty from Sinai, and they present the devastating evidence of Israel's breach of contract.
They list the charges. You worshiped the Baals, you trampled the poor, you took bribes in the courts, you ignored the widow and the orphan.
Precisely. They lay out the evidence and then they deliver the verdict. Therefore, the prophets explain the exile to Babylon is not a political defeat by a superior God.
It is a deeply theological covenant judgment, orchestrated by YHWH himself. God is using the foreign empires like Babylon as his instruments to enforce the sanctions of his own treaty.
The exile proves that God is still on the throne, holding his people accountable to his holy standard.
But the prosecuting attorneys don't just rest their case at condemnation. In the midst of the smoking ruins of Jerusalem and the despair of the exile, they introduce the ultimate pivot.
Because the earthly geographical monarchy failed so spectacularly, the prophets begin to shift the hope to the future. And they don't just hope for a restored local king in a rebuilt Jerusalem, they start hoping for something unimaginably bigger.
This is what scholars call the eschatological shift. The focus moves to an ultimate future resolution that transcends the old borders. The survey highlights the book of Daniel to illustrate this.
Right. Daniel is writing from the context of the exile surrounded by the power of Babylon. In Daniel chapter 7, he has a terrifying vision of 4 monstrous beasts emerging from the sea.
These beasts represent the violent, chaotic, crushing human empires of the world. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. They rule by devouring the earth.
But then the scene shifts to the heavenly courtroom. Daniel sees the Ancient of Days taking a seat on a fiery throne, and then approaching this ultimate judge is a figure described as like a son of man.
And this is the turning point of the entire canonical narrative. To this, Son of Man is given everlasting dominion, glory, and a kingdom. But it's not a localized kingdom in the Levant.
The text says that all peoples, nations, and languages will serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed.
That phrase, the Son of Man, is monumental.
It is. The Davidic hope of a restored monarchy evolves into a universal expectation. The Old Testament doesn't end by collapsing the theocracy in defeat. It actually expands it.
It moves from a localized geographic nation to a single dynasty, to a promised Messiah, and finally, to a multi-ethnic universal kingdom.
And for Christian theology, Jesus of Nazareth is the absolute culmination of this entire trajectory. It is not a coincidence that the title Jesus used most frequently for himself in the Gospels was the Son of Man from Daniel 7.
He was directly claiming that authority.
Right.
The survey points out that Jesus doesn't merely borrow ancient theocratic imagery to sound important, he functionally fulfills it.
Right.
The human kings of Israel failed because no single broken human could unite the necessary roles of perfect obedience and absolute authority. But Jesus is presented in the New Testament as perfectly uniting the offices of prophet, priest, and king.
He is the true vassal who perfectly obeys the Father where Israel failed, and he is the true king who exercises God's rule not by crushing his enemies, but by sacrificing himself for them.
And through that sacrifice, he inaugurates what the prophets called the New Covenant. We see this predicted in Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36, the promise that God will finally deal with the root issue, which is the human heart.
God says he will write the law in their hearts and put his spirit within them.
This is the massive functional difference. Under the Sinai covenant, the law was written on external stone tablets. It told you what to do, but it couldn't give you the moral power to do it. It ended up condemning you.
But the new covenant internalizes the law. It transforms the citizen from the inside out.
The earthly geographical theocracy, with its borders and its temple in Jerusalem, was the temporary prototype. The new covenant brings the kingdom universally and internally to anyone, anywhere who submits to the king.
Which brings us inevitably to the most crucial part of this entire discussion for you, the listener, the so what.
Right. Application is key here.
We have traced an enormous, dense historical reality. We started with the cosmic treaties of Genesis. We dug through the dirt of the late Bronze Age to read Egyptian victory spells and ancient tax receipts. We watched the tragic rise and the catastrophic fiery fall of Israel's kings, and we listened to the prosecuting prophets point toward a universal kingdom.
It's a lot to take in.
But you don't live in ancient Babylon and you don't live in first century Jerusalem. How do you actually apply this dense theology to your life today?
The survey concludes with a rigorous section on practical theology, and its applications are incredibly direct. First and foremost, the biblical model of theocracy completely destroys the modern idea that private spirituality and public life can be neatly separated.
You cannot compartmentalize your faith into a Sunday morning box. Because God claims sovereignty over the entire cosmos, true worship cannot be severed from ethics, economics, and public justice.
The way you treat your employees, the way you handle your finances, the way you speak about your political opponents, it's all subject to the king's moral authority.
Exactly. However, we have to address the massive danger of misapplication. Because many people look at the moral decay of our modern society, they read about the strict laws of the Old Testament, and they conclude we need to get back to that. We need to actively make our nation a Christian nation, seize political power, and enforce these biblical laws from the top down.
The survey delivers a very firm, explicit warning against exactly that kind of thinking, doesn't it?
It does. The expert source states unequivocally that the church receives absolutely no warrant from the text to replicate Israel's civil theocracy. None. It is a severe doctrinal error.
Let me try to frame it this way. Imagine you have a master blueprint drawn up by a genius engineer for an incredible, revolutionary prototype vehicle. But that prototype was designed specifically to run on tracks in a very specific environment thousands of years ago.
Right.
You cannot just take the blueprint for that ancient prototype, slap it onto a modern highway system, and try to build it using today's materials. It will crash and it will hurt people. The context is entirely different. Instead, you have to extract the underlying engineering principles.
That is a highly accurate analogy. You do not recreate the prototype. You extract the principles of the kingdom. And the survey outlines what those enduring principles are. First, that the unchecked centralization of human power is inherently dangerous and leans toward idolatry. Babel proved it, Pharaoh proved it, and Solomon proved it.
Second, that all human rulers, whether they are presidents, prime ministers, corporate CEOs, or church pastors, are not ultimate.
Every single one of them is middle management. Their authority is delegated, it is strictly limited, and they are fully accountable to a higher moral authority.
Yes. Leaders must remain completely submitted under the authority of Scripture, not above it. The primary lesson of the Kings is that power without obedience inevitably becomes oppression.
If human authority does not constantly submit to God's ethic of mishpat and tzedakah, justice and righteousness, it will eventually corrupt and exploit the very people it was appointed to shepherd.
This has been an absolutely massive journey.
It really has. We started with the radical claim of Genesis that humanity was created as living statues deputized to rule the earth. We looked at how Israel took the standard geopolitical treaty formats of the late Bronze Age and substituted the creator of the universe in inability as their suzerain.
We looked at the physical scars this nation left in the archaeological record. We watched them tragically reject their invisible king because they wanted a human warlord to fight their battles.
We watched those human kings fracture the nation through taxation and idolatry. We listened to the brilliant legal arguments of the prophets in the face of exile. And finally, we saw how that ancient prototype paved the way for a new covenant that writes the law directly onto the human heart.
It is a remarkable narrative arc. It is a story that profoundly shapes how we understand the very nature of power, justice, and authority. And as we close, I think there's a vital lingering question that the text leaves us with, specifically regarding the internalized reality of the new covenant.
What's the question you want to leave the listener with?
Well, if ancient Israel's physical geographic theocracy was always historically destined to fail under the weight of flawed human kings, only to be reborn as a universal internalized kingdom that completely transcends national borders, what does that mean for how you draw the boundaries of your own ethical and spiritual responsibilities today?
That's a deep question.
If the kingdom is no longer a physical piece of real estate on a map that you can point to or defend with an army, but rather a condition of the heart submitted to Christ, how does that fundamentally change the way you wield whatever small amount of authority you have in your own life, whether that authority is in your family, your workplace, or your local community? Are you acting as an autonomous ruler, building your own tiny empire? Or are you acting as a faithful delegated vicegerent, ensuring that justice and righteousness flow to the vulnerable around you?
That is something to seriously mull over. We started out this deep dive talking about how the word theocracy usually conjures up this bleak, oppressive image of a dystopian human regime trying to play God and crush its citizens. But what Chris Arvelosi's survey shows us is that the true biblical blueprint is the exact opposite.
It's a system brilliantly designed to limit human tyranny to protect the vulnerable through divine justice and to ultimately point us to a king who rules not by crushing his people but by redeeming them.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. You are now armed with a profoundly deeper, more nuanced understanding of ancient governance and its enduring, challenging legacy for us today.